extension 720. My guest tonight is G. Robert Blakey, a distinguished attorney, a specialist on organized crime, and the man who served as chief counsel and staff director for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the committee which, from late 76 to late 78, conducted what was to be the definitive investigation, going over all the terrain opened by the Warren Commission findings and then trod into mud by hundreds of other investigators, each with his own special conspiracy theory. This may or may not be the definitive and best judgment and the best study we can get on who killed Kennedy, but I find the book written by G. Robert Blakey and his associate Richard Billings most persuasive. The name of that book is The Plot to Kill the President, and much of the thesis is given in the subtitle, Organized Crime Assassinated JFK. We'll spend a full program tonight talking with Robert Blakey. The House Select Committee on Assassinations produced its report, thus its conclusions, after some 2 years of close investigation. G. Robert Blakey, who organized that whole investigation and served as chief counsel and staff director for the House Select Committee, has now given the nation a full report on the conclusions that the committee came to and the evidence upon which those conclusions were based. That is contained in his excellently written new book, The Plot to Kill the President. Mr. Blakey, you're a distinguished lawyer. I know you've had a lot of experience at the bar, that is in trial law. Let's open by playing this much as you would if you were a prosecuting attorney. And in your opening statement, you're going to state your basic thesis, and then you're going to spend all the rest of the trial proving it. What basically are you accusing somebody, and if so, who are you accusing?
The best way to understand the thesis of the plot to kill the president is to understand initially what the Warren Commission said in 1964. They said that John Kennedy was killed by one lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that there was no evidence of a conspiracy. The plot to kill the president concludes that that thesis is wrong. With the highest degree of confidence, it establishes that there were two shooters in Dealey Plaza. That is, two.
To extension 720. My guest tonight is G. Robert Blakey, a distinguished attorney, a specialist on organized crime, and the man who served as chief counsel and staff director for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the committee which, from late 76 to late 78, conducted what was to be the definitive investigation, going over all the terrain opened by the Warren Commission findings and then trod into mud by hundreds of other investigators, each with his own special conspiracy theory. This may or may not be the definitive and best judgment and the best study we can get on who killed Kennedy, but I find the book written by G. Robert Blakey and his associate Richard Billings most persuasive. The name of that book is The Plot to Kill the President, and much of the thesis is given in the subtitle, Organized Crime Assassinated JFK. We'll spend a full program tonight talking with Robert Blakey. The House Select Committee on Assassinations produced its report, thus its conclusions, after some 2 years of close investigation. G. Robert Blakey, who organized that whole investigation and served as chief counsel and staff director for the House Select Committee, has now given the nation a full report on the conclusions that the committee came to and the evidence upon which those conclusions were based. That is contained in his excellently written new book, The Plot to Kill the President. Mr. Blakey, you're a distinguished lawyer. I know you've had a lot of experience at the bar, that is in trial law. Let's open by playing this much as you would if you were a prosecuting attorney. And in your opening statement, you're going to state your basic thesis, and then you're going to spend all the rest of the trial proving it. What basically are you accusing somebody, and if so, who are you accusing?
The best way to understand the thesis of the plot to kill the president is to understand initially what the Warren Commission said in 1964. They said that John Kennedy was killed by one lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that there was no evidence of a conspiracy. The plot to kill the president concludes that that thesis is wrong. With the highest degree of confidence, it establishes that there were two shooters in Dealey Plaza. That is, two people independently firing at the President of the United States. From that...
One from the book depository, and that was Lee Harvey Oswald. The other, indeed, from the grassy knoll.
That's correct. Consequently, the plot to kill the President then proceeds from the major premise that there was a conspiracy. And that it has with the highest degree of confidence. It then explores what the possible hue, color, shape of that conspiracy might have been. It first explores whether the Russians, under Khrushchev, may have been responsible for the President's death, and there is substantial evidence to believe that they might, although the book concludes that they were not. It explores next whether Castro's Cuba might have been responsible for the President's death, and there is substantial evidence, a good deal of it not previously revealed, to indicate that he was. The book ultimately concludes that he was not.
You're entertaining all of these hypotheses, making the best case you can for them, but then, as you analyze the material fully, deciding that the case that can be made for those hypotheses is not good enough.
A principal difference between The Plot to Kill the President and many books written on the assassination is that it treats the reader as an intelligent adult. That is, it sets out evidence on both sides of an issue and then explains to the reader why the authors, Dick Billings and myself, conclude something different. The central thesis of the book, after it explored the reasonable alternatives, is that elements of organized crime, seeking to relieve organized crime of the incredible pressure taking the form of investigation, prosecution, and conviction that the Kennedy administration had brought on them, conceived of a plot involving Lee Harvey Oswald and arranged for and brought about the death of John Kennedy.
And we've got to look into the evidence that you think suggests and even confirms that interpretation. But let me pursue this with a certain quizzical confusion at the moment. Isn't there something called, is it Lansky's Law or Lansky's Rule, that you never, if you're in organized crime, you never actually destroy a cop, a judge, a prosecutor?
No. There is no such thing as Lansky's Rule.
You mention it in the book.
Well, what we treat in the book is a common impression that exists by prosecutors that, and I make this as clear as I can, the word is generally, as a rule, normally, but hardly inflexibly. Some members of organized crime, the more intelligent, have not engaged in retaliatory actions against policemen and prosecutors, that they've treated it as a business matter. As long as the prosecution is fair, no unfair advantage is taken, it's treated as a business matter.
So long as they play by their rules, just as we play by our rules, we honor or at least respect their pursuing their
The gangster's world is one of violence. The prosecutor and policeman's world is one of law. As long as the policeman or the prosecutor stays in his world, the gangster will not take revenge. Now, that common impression is, in fact, not entirely accurate. There are a variety of examples that I can lay out for you. For example, the Capone mob out of Chicago here was responsible for killing a mayor, a district attorney, assistant district attorney, a state senator.
Which mayor?
Not of Chicago, a downstate mayor.
A downstate mayor.
That's correct. So that this notion that they don't kill policemen or public officials is just not true. Well, now, the point being is that normally they don't. You have to seek a reason other than the normal enforcement of the law. So in that sense, there is no such thing as the Lansky Rule in the sense of a scientific principle that governs their conduct, to which there is no exception. What you have is a practice. And I think that is very, very true on the whole of practice.
The strongest argument I can make against your basic conclusion doesn't derive from the evidence at all. I find the evidence that you discovered and organized startling, persuasive, and utterly fascinating. But rather, it's on the basis of a certain kind of inference. If I were in organized crime and met with some of my colleagues and said, we're going to call off the heavy heat we're taking from the Attorney General by killing his brother, the President, that will certainly be a signal to Robert Kennedy, and that will end this strong campaign against us, which is beginning to be costly and nerve-wracking. I would then commission a plan more effective than the one that seems to have been mounted. At least I would get more shooters. An awful lot is invested in just one sort of crazy or odd fellow that we've drawn in. Maybe he'll kill the President. Even if he doesn't, he'll serve as a patsy for us to deflect attention from organized crime, and some other shooter who stands on the grassy knoll and, according to your evidence, gets off only one shot. I would have, at least if we're going to do it in Dealey Plaza, I would have surrounded him with 5 or 6 shooters, and I would have had alternative possibilities to get him elsewhere if we missed him in Dealey Plaza.
Okay.
It doesn't look like enough of an organized plot.
I can't find myself in disagreement with what you're saying entirely. When I went down to take over the chief counsel's position, I considered myself experienced in the area of organized crime and organized crime investigations. While I was open-minded professionally, I was personally very skeptical that there'd been a conspiracy. And had you asked my opinion, I would have told you the mob didn't do it. They are a low-risk venture operation. This was obviously a high-risk venture. They just wouldn't do that.
High risk in that there was a great possibility of failure and or of exposure.
Well, can you think about this? Suppose they had only wounded the president. If there's any rule that's around, it's don't wound the line, kill him.
Mm-hmm.
And once they risked shooting the president and missing him, can you imagine what would have happened in this country? The mob simply would not have been safe. In other words, what they risked in trying to get him was so high, it was my judgment that they wouldn't have done it. The whole history, as I understood it, had been one of a careful analysis of benefit and risk and a conservative policy. The history of me on the committee, personally, the intellectual history, was one of me constantly coming in contact with evidence that I did not previously know about that began to push on me and cause me to re-examine my own position. Having said that, I ultimately came to believe that there were 2 shooters in the plaza, and I think that's with the highest degree of confidence. If you ultimately disagree with me on whether the mob did it, I am not one of those kind of people who say, if you disagree with me, you're crazy. An honest man can read this and disagree with it. But what I think you'll do is when you come in with an honest man who reads it, it is the single most plausible explanation of the 2 shooters. Now, when you think about it in retrospect, hey, it did work. You might have been able to think a better plan, but the one they put together was successful.
Well, why not provide 3 or 4 more shooters?
Well, I'm inclined... Now, I can tell you what I know that they did. What you've asked me is a question of to speculate on why they wouldn't have done it otherwise. Mm-hmm. And I'm willing to do that, but I want to underline the words speculation or inference. It's my own judgment that there was not supposed to be 2 shooters, that there was only supposed to have been one, Lee Harvey Oswald. And if you think about it for a moment from the perspective of the man behind the fence, Lee Harvey Oswald fires once and misses. Lee Harvey Oswald fires the second time and John Kennedy is wounded and not killed. It's only at that point that the man from the grassy knoll fires. And 0.7 of a second after he fires, Oswald fires
for the third
time.
Yeah.
And explodes the president's head. That, incidentally, is why the man from the grassy knoll never fired again. From his perspective, he killed Kennedy. He fired once, and Kennedy's head exploded. He had done his job. I'm inclined to think he only fired because he thought he had a wounded president. I'm inclined to believe that his role in the plaza, and I have no specific evidence for this, may well have been as an observer and not a participant. It may well have been that his participation would have been to have killed Oswald when he was brought out of the depository, as I think they had every reason to suspect he would have been. Remember, he's up in a perch. There's every reason to believe that he will be arrested and brought out of the depository. The man in the plaza is probably there to kill him. Oswald, by a fluke, escapes. And then what we have is not a well-oiled plot. What we have is a disaster unfolding over several days while Oswald is in custody. Eventually he's going to talk, and they have to enlist Jack Ruby. Now, that's my explanation of how it would have been more reasonable only to have used Oswald. But let's be realistic. That's speculation. That's not based on the evidence. The hard evidence is that within 48 hours, Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And
you are quite convinced, and of course this is part of your extended thesis, that Jack Ruby was a hitman operating with full conscious complicity and under orders from, quote, organized crime.
From my analysis of Jack Ruby, and I think he indeed is the Rosetta Stone to the assassination. And the logical alternatives are simple. Lee Harvey Oswald, first of all, we know it was a conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald was probably one of those members, high degree of confidence. He is then killed within 48 hours by a person. Either Jack Ruby killed him, as the Warren Commission told us Oswald killed the president, as a lone assassin, or as part of a group. If he did it as part of a group, I want to see who he was associated with. All of Jack Ruby's ties go back into organized crime.
Way back to a relationship with the Capone organization in this town.
That's correct. He grew up in the Lawndale section of Chicago. He was associated with the Davy Miller gang here. He was actually a runner for... What I'm saying is, he grew up in a cult culture and a matrix of crime and corruption. It was part and parcel of his entire life. He was a violent man. He was a thug for a corrupt union here.
Mm-hmm.
He worked and ran a strip bar that was part of an organized crime circuit. He was a minor participant in an organized crime operation involving the most sophisticated level of people, Santos Traficante in Cuba. What I'm saying is, he has all the earmarks of an organized crime hitman. If I could find a good explanation for him having killed Kennedy, other than the organized crime, I would say I'd have to live with it.
For his having killed Oswald, you know.
That's correct. I'm sorry. He offered two explanations. One is he cared enough about Kennedy that he didn't want Mrs. Kennedy to have to come back for the trial. Of course, the question that can be raised there, if he cared that much about Kennedy, why didn't he bother to watch him in the parade? In fact, Jack Ruby was down at the newspaper office dealing with his ads. His lawyer offered an explanation that he was insane, in the sense that he had a form of epilepsy rooted in a brain damage that led him to act in a non-responsible way. We very carefully examined Jack Ruby's autopsy. There was no evidence of brain damage. The jury examined in Jack Ruby's trial his explanation that he was insane other than rooted in epilepsy, and rejected it. And the psychiatric testimony is ample that it wasn't there. As to his explanation that he did it to save Mrs. Kennedy the trip, Jack Ruby, in his own handwriting, gave his lawyer a note saying that that was false. When you go through the other explanations, each one can be refuted.
We've got to get to some commercials in almost an instant, but I want to get one clarification on the record before we pause for those commercials. You are not suggesting that Lee Harvey Oswald was aware that he was a tool of organized crime?
No, I'm not.
To the contrary, he was deceived as to who his sponsors were.
That's correct.
And we need to develop that in more clarity later. And as well, I think when we return, we want to look directly at the evidence that began to push you in the direction, the hard evidence that began to push you in the direction of abandoning the soul-crazed assassin theory. That comes more than anything else to the acoustic evidence, which seems to indicate a shot from the grassy knoll.
That's correct.
Much, George Bauer. My guest tonight is G. Robert Blakey, who is the co-author with Richard Billings of the new book, The Plot to Kill the President. That book just recently published by New York Times Books. Mr. Blakey was, of course, the chief counsel and staff director of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. We can view this book as a report to the general public of the findings of that committee. You said earlier there are two crucial things in your argument. First, the evidence of a second shooter on the grassy knoll, and that establishes conspiracy. Two or more persons working in concert to produce a certain effect. In this case, the assassination of the president. A second basic question, if conspiracy, who engineered the conspiracy? What group, if any such group, can be identified? There are grounds for considering, but then ruling out the Soviets and the Cubans, and we are left with organized crime, coded the mafia. And we've got to look at the evidence that suggests both of those. To begin with, we go to the grassy knoll. There have been lots of grassy knoll theorists around for years. They were basing their conclusion that there was a second or even a second and third shooter on the grassy knoll from evidence on various photographs and strips of film and from footprints that some claim they found behind the picket fence. That isn't the evidence that persuades you.
No, it's not. The truth is that the Warren Commission decided that there were only 3 shots, 2, perhaps 3 shots, and they did that principally on the basis of the physical evidence. And the most persuasive piece of evidence that they had were the 3 expended shells in the depository. They rejected the testimony of approximately 29 people that
said they saw something off at the grassy knoll.
Heard something. Heard something from the grassy knoll.
Heard as well as saw.
Heard or saw some manifestation of the grassy knoll, and they did so because there was no corroboration, physical corroboration of that testimony. They didn't say it didn't exist. They said it was not credible.
Mm-hmm.
What really makes a difference between the committee and Dick and I in the plot to kill the president is the fact that we now have physical corroboration. We found a tape recording of the sounds of the assassination that had been accidentally made by a police officer, H. B. McLean, in the plaza of that crucial 8 seconds. And that tape gives us the timing and direction of the 4 shots.
He was sitting on his motorcycle. He couldn't close the microphone on his motorcycle radio, so to speak.
Well, no, it turned out what happened is his brake cable used to hit it and turn it on, and he wasn't aware of it. And the sounds were broadcast from the plaza back to the dispatcher tape. 2
questions in relation to that. One, how can you analyze from such a recording of the transmission from a radio on a policeman's motorcycle? How can you that discreetly analyze where a certain pop sound comes from, what direction it comes from?
Well,
second question, where was this evidence all these years? How come it only surfaced a few years ago?
It was never hidden. It was never it was never covered up. The truth is, it was always in everybody's possession. The FBI had it, and they had transcribed the tape for the voices on it, but they had never subjected it to a sophisticated acoustical analysis. We did that.
So it was never a lost tape. It was
never a lost tape. One of the ironies of it is everybody talks about covers up in the Kennedy case. There was no cover up. This was just simply never uncovered. What we did is we went down in July of 78, or August of 78, and reconstructed the sounds of the assassination by firing guns. And we had
right there in Dealey Plaza.
Right there in Dealey Plaza. And what that gave us was if you will, a fingerprint of sound. In an urban environment like Dealey Plaza, the echo structure of the plaza, that is, the muzzle blast goes directly to the microphone. It goes indirectly to the microphone by bouncing off a wall. That time difference between the first time that the muzzle blast reaches the microphone and the second time that the muzzle blast reaches the microphone by hitting a major acoustical feature creates a series of times when echoes arrive.
So it's a kind of acoustic fingerprint which enables you to locate the source of the sound.
That's correct. Once you know where the microphone is, and you know the speed of sound and the temperature of the air and the acoustical features, you can plot back to where the sound came from. Since we had a perfect fingerprint of our own, what we then had to do was match the perfect fingerprint of our own against the fingerprints we had on the tape actually taken in 1963. And we found all 4 shots. Yeah, we found the 3 shots that the Warren Commission had found, and frankly found them more or less as the Warren Commission had found them. And that there's a perfect corroboration or a correspondence between the film of Abraham Zapruder of the events of the assassination, the ballistics testimony, the other eyewitness reports, and our tape. So, I mean, there really isn't any dispute among people who understand physics.
I was about to ask you about the people who understand physics and understand the physics of acoustics especially. How many experts did you have evaluate the tape? Did they operate with total independence of one another? How many out of the total number who did evaluate came to this conclusion?
What we did is we went to the Acoustical Society of America and asked for the top people in the field. We took the top person on the list, the Bolt, Brannick, and Newman. They were, the head of Bolt, Brannick, and Newman was the chairman of Judge Sirica's panel on the Watergate tapes. Really one of the top firms in the country. There's just no doubt about that. We had them do the basic work for us. We then had 2 other people from Queens College serve as our kind of experts on the experts, and we played them off back and forth. They came to the judgment that independently of one another, that in fact that what we had found on the tape was to a 95 degree of certainty, not identity, but to a 95 degree of certainty, a shot from the grassy knoll. Now, that shot doesn't stand just on the acoustics. We now can go back and look at the original testimony. Let's take a look at the 20-some-odd people who said they heard something from the grassy knoll. They include people like Paul Landis, a Secret Service agent, who was riding on a car directly behind the president. They include people like Bill and Gail Newman, who were actually on the grassy knoll and heard a shot come in over their head. There are photographs of him pushing his family to the ground because he heard a shot over his head. There are people like S.M. Holland, who were standing on the overpass and saw the events of the assassination. Oswald's first shot, Conley turn around, the second shot that hit the president, then this puff of smoke from the grassy knoll, and finally the 4th shot from the depository. We have ear witness and eyewitness testimony that fully supports the acoustics tape. I don't think there's real disagreement.
No,
there ought not be real disagreement on the question, was there a conspiracy?
It sounds very compelling, and I found that part of your book very valuable and utterly persuasive. Let me say this is WGN Radio from Chicago, and taking that as establishing the second shooter, the shooter on the grassy knoll, and thus conspiracy, the larger question now, the mafia connection. I want to just ask you how you know, and this means pulling together many different lines of evidence, all of which are reviewed in your book in more detail than, of course, you can develop here. But I want to get out of your way and let you develop those major strands of evidence so that you can show us what brought you and your colleagues to the conclusion that an element of organized crime did indeed use its organizing abilities to sponsor this conspiracy.
Okay. What I start with is that there are three facts: the president's death, Oswald's participation, and Jack Ruby's assassination of Oswald. We then went into the associations of Jack Ruby. He has all the earmarks, as I indicated, of a hitman for organized crime. The question then is, would organized crime have done it? And so we went to look at the character of each of those people, the major participants. And we asked ourselves, are these the kind of people who kill each other? Well, that almost answers itself by asking it. Having said that, we asked, was there any special relationship between these people and John Kennedy that they would have killed him? And this is one clear example of how I thought the investigation would come out one way and it came out another. One of the things that the Warren Commission did not know in 1964 was that the FBI had been conducting an extensive program of illegal electronic surveillance. For example, here in Chicago, in the Armory Lounge, Sam Giancana, who was at that time the leader of the outfit, was under electronic surveillance.
The Armory Lounge was his place, or the place where he held court, so to speak.
That's correct. He was under electronic surveillance. I knew in later years that that was the case. I figured this is a great way to prove the mob didn't do it. And I must say that kind of cast me in an unusual role. Most of my life has been spent in studying them and working to strengthen legislation to prosecute them. But I figured the electronic surveillance program, which was nationwide, would have covered them adequately to make a judgment that they didn't do it. So here I go with a scientific hypothesis. They didn't do it, and their conversations before and after the assassination will prove it.
Conversations picked up through telephone
primarily
taps?
bugging. No, not
through the bugging of spatial locations?
Bugging. There were no illegal wiretaps. There were extensive illegal bugging.
Mm-hmm.
And the bugging is far, far more important because...
So the Armory Lounge was loaded with hidden microphones.
That's correct. And you can go into city after city in this country. And I thought 6 months before the assassination, 6 months after, it will prove they didn't do it. Well, what we found out when we began listening, or rather looking at the transcripts, was organized crime, in fact, hated the Kennedys. Not just in a general sort of way, but very specific. There are conversations in which they discuss killing the president. They're set out in the plot to kill the president. They are disturbing in nature. They viewed the Kennedy program as a personal vendetta. They blamed Bobby Kennedy personally and the president. So here you have people whose character are such that they are murderers. Hateful of the president, desiring the president's death. Far from beginning to prove that they didn't do it, I'm saying, oh my God, I'm proving that they did. Then the crucial question was, how adequate was the surveillance in New Orleans, Tampa, and Dallas, the likely place where the plot was hatched? Contrary to what I believed when I began the investigation, they did not have bugs in Dallas, New Orleans, and Tampa, so that the electronic surveillance could not prove that they didn't do it. What the electronic surveillance proved is that they had the character, and they had the motive, and they were in a position to do it. Then we began to go in and looking at the relationship between the major organized crime figures and people like Jack Ruby. We found a direct relationship between Jack Ruby and Santos Trafficante.
Let's make clear who Trafficante is.
Santos Trafficante is the leader of organized crime in Tampa. He was a major leader of organized crime in Havana under Castro's Cuba.
Castro's or Batista's Cuba?
I'm sorry, Batista's Cuba. And he was a deeply disappointed man as a result of the Cuban Revolution, in which he lost his interest in gambling. And he blamed the Kennedys for the failure of the Bay of Pigs, for a failure to restore him to his prior position in Havana. We went in and looked at the character and background of Carlos Marcello, who is the leader of organized crime in New Orleans. Here's a man that Bobby Kennedy, at least from Carlos Marcello's perspective, was personally responsible for deporting him. Who were his associates? It turned out that a private investigator who worked for Carlos Marcello's lawyer, a man named David Ferry, probably had a homosexual relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald when he was a young man. and was seen with him that fateful summer of 1962.
Also gave him flying lessons, is that right?
Well, he was in a Civil Air Patrol unit, and that's when he was a young man. So here we have a direct association between Lee Harvey Oswald and a major organized crime figure. All of a sudden, from a situation where they didn't do it, my God, they might have done it, good Lord, they had the motive to do it, I can't believe that there are associations that the Warren Commission did not go into between the major figures in organized crime.
But you don't have any electronic surveillance or transcripts of actual tapes in which Marcello or Traficante are literally saying, we're organizing this plot, we're going to get the president.
No, there is no electronic surveillance. On the other hand, as to Carlos Marcello, there is a witness, a man named Becker, who told the FBI that he was present when Carlos Marcello made a very specific threat against the president and said that he would kill him, or said that he would bring about his death, that he would use a nut to do it, and made the following comparison, that the president was a dog that was biting on him, and if you chop off the tail, the Attorney General, the head would continue to bite him. But if you chop off the head, you take care of both the head and the tail. That's a very disturbing statement coming in September of 62. And then to see associations between the assassin and Carlos Marcello's people, and then to see the assassin killed by a man who has all the earmarks of organized crime.
I don't know whether it was ever true or whether it's true now or whether it was true in 1963, but an image that we have of organized crime is that it's got a command structure, it's got a hierarchy, it's got a central board of directors, so to speak, and major undertakings, major hits could not, in fact, be mounted without approval from all the relevant people with veto power.
With one exception.
What's the exception?
Because the New Orleans family was the first family of La Cosa Nostra, or the Mafia, it has always had a degree of independence. I mean, again, this was the kind of thing. What you said is indeed the case, and is the general rule. A hit of this character would be a matter for the National Commission. And the coverage on the National Commission was adequate enough to say that they probably didn't participate in it. But when you take as a possible suspect the Marcello organization, and you then find that the Marcello organization has always been, and is today, independent of the National Commission, you start falling in exceptions. What really bothered me was I assumed that they wouldn't do it based on all I knew until I carefully investigated it. And then I found exceptions that kept coming up, or contrary evidence kept coming up. In the end, I just simply could not resist the force of the evidence.
But what exactly then is the thesis that the evidence forces upon you? That organized crime, operating in concert and with some approval from the National Commission, launched this plan, or rather that it was an aberrant undertaking by the New Orleans family and nobody else?
I think that the best argument, the best analysis of the evidence is it was an independent operation by the New Orleans and Tampa family. Let me say is that is not simply an inference from circumstantial evidence. The book also reports the testimony of John Rosselli, given to Jack Anderson in confidence. John Rosselli sat down with Jack Anderson, knowing that he was probably marked for death because the word was out in the underworld and he had cooperated in the grand jury. And he told Jack, he says, Jack, this is what really happened in the Kennedy assassination. I don't want you to use it until something happens to me. In fact, Cubans connected to Santos Traficante were responsible for the president's death. Lee Harvey Oswald fired at him, but he was killed from an ambush up front. Jack Ruby was brought in. He was just a punk afterwards to kill Oswald. It may be, he added the latter as speculation, that Castro had found out about Santos Traficante's plots against himself, and he had turned Santos Traficante's Cubans back against the president. But what he was clear about is organized crime was responsible for the president's death. What he speculated is it might have been in league with Castro's Cuba. Now, if you go back and ask, is there any corroboration for Oswald having connections to Cubans? And the answer is yes. Among other things, there's a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald distributing literature. The
Fair Play for Cuba Committee thing.
That's correct.
On the streets of New Orleans.
And one of the people with him was never identified, and you can look at the photograph.
Yes, I have looked at it.
The man is obviously Latin. And there are a number of sightings of Lee Harvey Oswald that summer with people who are described variously as Latin, Mexican, or Spanish.
But the question is, are they pro-Castro Latins or anti-Castro Latins?
Well, my guess on that one, and this one is, again, a synthesis of all the evidence, is Lee Harvey Oswald's basic political ideology is left-wing. He self-described as a Marxist. I have no belief that he understood dialectical materialism and was in any sense a understanding of what he was, but he thought of himself as a Marxist. He defected to the Soviet Union. He was a public supporter of Castro in that summer. I believe because of that, he was susceptible to being involved in a plot by organized crime-connected Cubans who were really anti-Castro in such a way as he would then think he was participating in a Castro-led conspiracy. And if he were caught, until he finally confessed all the details, he would represent an effort by Castro to kill the president.
Now, let me see if I understand that. What you're suggesting is that they drew Oswald in not by telling him who really had masterminded the whole operation that was getting started, but rather that some Cubans or other Latins told him they were pro-Castro people, part of a pro-Castro movement, and orders had come from Havana, essentially, that the president must be assassinated. And Oswald believed that he was working for Castro when, in fact, he was really working for the Mafia, plus some disaffected anti-Castro Cubans who had gone into league with the Mafia.
It gets very complicated, and
I think I followed it so far. If I've summarized it correctly.
That's correct, and let me say is I think that's the best explanation for what happened. It certainly is the one that's consistent with all the evidence, and then you have the perfect operation. If Oswald is identified, and he indeed will be, it may very well provoke that attack by the president, by the United States against Castro's Cuba, so that
which could bring down the Castro government and gambling could be reestablished in Havana.
Absolutely. So that the plot has the best chance of working. It is an apparently pro-Castro plot and a single assassin. If it is successful, it will indeed point away from organized crime, and it will point to Castro's Cuba. I think it is a very sophisticated plot.
But it won't completely point away from organized crime because you've got Ferry linked to Oswald. That might be turned up. You've also got an uncle of Oswald's living in New Orleans. I'd never heard about Dutz, what's-his-name, before till I read your book. And he's got Mafia connections. Oswald's uncle has.
The strongest in the evidence of who was responsible for the president's death are left-wing, are Cuban, and are Russian. But for the fact that Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, and that points towards the organized crime, I would have said that elements of either the KGB, the Soviet secret police, or the DGI, the Cuban secret police, were responsible for the president's death. It's only when you put Jack Ruby in it that you begin to see that the true nature of the plot was not what it appeared to be.
And Jack Ruby gets into it only because the full scenario of the plot misfired, and the quick assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald shortly after he assassinated the president did not come off as was planned.
I think that's the best explanation Again, what you have to do is look at the hard evidence. And the hard evidence says conspiracy, organized. And then as you try to develop a coherent explanation of some of the things that appear to be consistent, we can offer those kind of things. But remember, we know things with different degrees of confidence.
There's an extra angle in this, which you do develop in the book, and which the committee looked into rather closely, involving Sam Giancana of the Chicago area, the President of the United States, and a woman whose favors they apparently shared for a while, that, of course, being Judith Campbell Exner. I'd like to fit that into the picture after we take care of these messages. With thanks to George Bauer, my guest tonight, G. Robert Blakey, is these days professor of law at Notre Dame University, rather at the Law School of Notre Dame, and he is there as well the director of the Notre Dame Institute on Organized Crime. He was, of course, the chief counsel and staff director of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and has given us a report on the conclusions and the full research effort of the committee in his new book, co-authored with Richard N. Billings. The name of the book, The Plot to Kill the President. It's just published by New York Times Books. Virginia Campbell Exner, Sam Giancana, John F. Kennedy. A strange trio. Does it have anything to do with the assassination?
This is a very difficult thing to talk about, but let me see if I can't, with appropriate delicacy, bring it out. One of the largest things I had to overcome in turning myself around and coming to believe that the president was killed by organized crime was this myth, if you want to call it that the mob does not retaliate against legitimate public officials doing their work. I mean, there are obviously exceptions. We mentioned earlier Mayor Jeff Stone of Culp, Illinois, was killed by the Capone mob. When you go back and look at those previous political assassinations that organized crime was involved in, there was always something that the public official did to make himself vulnerable, other than just enforce the law. So what we did is we went back into Kennedy's background and asked ourselves, did he do anything that in some way made himself vulnerable? Well, the first thing we found was the substantial belief by organized crime that his father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was involved in bootlegging. The Kennedy family denies it. Nevertheless, major organized crime figures believed it. And the important question now is their state of mind.
Now, Joseph Kennedy's main biographer seems to affirm it.
In other words, the real question is not whether he did it. The question is what did organized crime believe? That's probably not enough that the father may have had unsavory relationships. We went in and looked at the nature of the 1960 election, and Chicago is a very relevant place to talk about that. The electronic surveillance program of the FBI establishes beyond all question that in Cook County, the West Side Bloc, principally led by organized crime figures, stole the 1960 election. If you take the votes in Texas that were were questionably taken by Johnson's organization and add it to the votes that were stolen in Cook County, that makes the difference.
What do you have on electronic surveillance that establishes that for Chicago?
Conversations between Sam Giancana and public officials in Chicago saying that the election was stolen, and discussing what votes were stolen and what precincts they were stolen in and how many there were. And you have conversations.
Thus we get that dialogue that Ben Bradley reports on the night of the election, where Mayor Daley says to Senator Kennedy, waiting anxiously in his home in Georgetown, what's that exact line?
With a few good friends and a little time, and we'll make it for you. Well, the good friends turned out to be organized crime. And you have statements by Sam Giancana to the effect that, to Judith Exter, among other people, listen, honey, if it wasn't for me, your boyfriend wouldn't be in the White House. So what you begin having now is a relationship with the father, a political support for him. There's every indication that organized crime contributed money to the Kennedy election through Frank Sinatra. This is certainly what organized crime says on the microphones. So here you have them, a relationship with the father, giving votes, giving money, and that probably wouldn't have been enough to make the president vulnerable. But what you do have is Frank Sinatra introduces Judith Campbell to President Kennedy. She was, at that time, connected to a group called the Rat Pack, composed of Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., including John Rosselli, the mob's man. And including
the president's brother-in-law, Peter Lawford.
Peter Lawford. John Rosselli was the Chicago delegate of organized crime in Las Vegas. And Judith Campbell is an example of a number of pretty young things that were passed around in that group. She was, bluntly, passed to the president. And after a lot of thought about it, I'm inclined to conclude that that's kind of the point at which he crossed the line. That's the point at which he became vulnerable. He had now taken from them money, votes, and finally sex. And when he was not in fact corrupt, they did not get their quid pro quo, that Robert Kennedy came in and turned on them an unprecedented organized crime program. It wasn't just business anymore. It was seen as a personal thing. It was seen as
You're saying that they felt their honor had been violated. This guy, Kennedy, owes us. We've been nice to him in many ways, including Judith Campbell Exner.
I think that's...
And now he lets his brother do this to us.
I think
he's violating his obligation.
I think that they thought, they believed that they would be treated differently than they were. And when they were treated as they were, they resented it. They did not consider it just business. They said, this guy took our votes, our money, and our sex, and now he gives us this. I think that's what made the assassination thinkable for them.